Hi everyone, I'm Debbie from the CBA. I'm the festival coordinator. I'm here just to let you know that we're recording this, so if you wanted to see it later on, and also we have captions on, so if you do need captions on your screen, you can go on the More button and enable subtitles or disable them if you don't need them. We are going to have at the end a poll. It's just a 3 quick question poll, which we'd really appreciate you filling in. And then after this event, there'll be an email to just fill in a longer survey. I know people probably are surveyed out during the festival, but it really helps us because then we can go for more funding year on year once this survey is completed. So your first speaker today is Jeremy, and he'll share the screen with you. So I hope you really enjoy this event.
Okay, so is the screen shared okay for everyone? I think it's there.
Yep.
Yep.
Shared.
Okay.
Although you're not on slideshow, Jeremy.
Oh, yeah. Right, here we go. Okay, this talk, sort of really this small presentation by us in the Buildings Archaeology Group, really sort of just had its origins in some discussion amongst us about the values of historic buildings and how to look at historic buildings in a broader context. It's as simple as that. Due to I must add right at the beginning that due to some severe technical difficulties, communications, Esther Robinson very much regrets she can't be with us. And what we will do after this is, we putting together some notes on web links and so forth, and I'll put what I can put onto the chat as well later on. So this session might well be finished before 3:30. So I've got about 20 minutes, and we'll be finished by before 2:30, and we'll be then handing over to Catherine Bell from the Council of British Archaeology, and then to Bev Kerr. So we hope you enjoy the session, and this is really just putting up some issues really for some archaeology of buildings. So right at the very beginning, I think we just need to hammer home this point that buildings are absolutely central to how we look at and how we perceive places. There's a fantastic definition of landscape in something called the European Landscape Convention, which really sums up the idea of landscape being doubly cultural. Landscape is an area as perceived by people whose character is the result of the action and interaction of natural and or human factors. Here we have, in a poster by Frank Newbold, published at the beginning of the Second World War, a shepherd walking across a landscape in the Downs towards a farmstead, whose arrangement of buildings, the form of the roofs, the relationship to landscape makes such a critical contribution to the character of the Downs. There is little doubt there that that group of buildings makes a really important contribution to local distinctiveness, which is a theme, well, which has been an increasingly significant theme really since the later 19th century, since we moved on from a fascination in, let's say, church architecture as sort of symbolic of national patrimony towards the joy of understanding traditional and vernacular buildings in the landscape. There in the Batsford series in the period between the wars. And more difficult is to really consider what buildings, perhaps quite plain buildings, actually mean in terms of their historical significance, their communal significance. There's a huge amount of work that has been developing in this country and in other countries for the last 100 years or more in really uncovering the immense richness of our historic buildings. We've got peasant buildings going back into the 13th century in this country now, which have been dated through dendrochronology. That sort of thing is not the focus of this talk. It's really looking at what buildings, how buildings might reflect sort of broader historical and values and considerations, and in turn might reflect and in turn inform us, our own communal value of what is significant. This is a building. I was an inspector of historic buildings in English Heritage quite a long time ago, an inspector for the Southwest, and this building turned up, which is one of the huts at Poldhu in the Lizard. And here in 1901, Marconi proved that radio could work over the horizon and then over the Atlantic to Newfoundland. Incredibly important grouping of huts. But 20 years ago, there was no real certainty well, is a hut a historic building? It's just a hut. And you say, well, actually something very important happened here. But how does the hut reflect the significance? That indeed was an issue at Bletchley Park, which I was personally much involved with. And there was although the mansion at Bletchley Park was listed at grade 2 and Bletchley Park had been made into a conservation area, there was similar uncertainty over actually what was the significance of the huts and the blocks at Bletchley Park. So we stepped back and said, well, we need initially just to put together what we know and set out what we feel are the values of Bletchley Park and how those values are expressed in the buildings, on the face of it, quite plain looking buildings. The larger blocks are temporary office blocks of a type built throughout the country during the war. And of course, the huts, the famous huts are also of a type, although slightly bespoke, that was repeated ad infinitum across the country during the war. What we did was define what the values of Bletchley Park are in terms of their historical values, the scientific value, the political value, as you can see there, and then consider actually how are those values enshrined in the buildings. And it was really a first step. There was an assumption that no documents existed at Bletchley Park, which was very far from the truth. We found very quickly there was a huge richness of documents enabling us to date the huts and then to sort of put the huts within the context of the war, and also things such as the development of information technology. That enabled us to move on and then do more detailed archaeological recording of the buildings to better understand in much further detail how they reflect the functions which they were intended for. But it was the initial understanding that was so vital, just putting together what we knew and putting that into a broader context. So really, well, I suppose the Second World War and indeed Frank Newbold's poster sort of touches on a theme of modernization, these events, and Newbold's poster sort of touches on a theme of modernization that we do see in another seemingly very different building type, which is the Lido, which comes into being in the period, well, in progressive authorities from in outdoor swimming pools from the late 19th century, but really comes into its own in the interwar period. I'm going to hear talk about a building, again, a group of buildings where again, there was uncertainty about their value. In the case of Bletchley Park, just to very briefly recap, none of the buildings were listed, but we were able to sort of show that how they reflected values and therefore move on, get some funding from English partnerships and funding towards the site, which was absolutely critical to securing its future. And then the detailed recording and the designations followed from that. We're again dealing with another unlisted site. Here, at least unlisted until last year, but at the time of a public inquiry which threatened this site, this was not listed. This is the Lido at Cheltenham Spa. The buildings, again, are quite plain. They reflect in many respects the intention of the style of Edwardian garden designers such as Mawson. But the master plan for the site was laid out by Edward White, who became the first president of what is now the Landscape Institute. The buildings were put together as part of a scheme, very much part of a place. And again, which would happen just behind the cafe at the top slide there, wouldn't really undermine the significance of the site because it wasn't that sort of significant as a group of buildings. What we wanted to stress was that the buildings were an integral part of a place, an integral part of an experiential landscape, in many respects a unique, a hugely significant experiential landscape. What is more bizarre, after all, than coming through a central block, divesting yourself of your clothing either side, and then walking into this sort of ritual landscape where you'd swim up and down with a fountain, the symbol of purity, and so on and so forth. We wanted to ask people using the Lido, this is something I was doing in my own time, but it was really why we wanted to try and relate this experiential landscape, take, if you like, an archaeological approach to looking at the whole site, and then sort of get people's thoughts on what makes the Lido a special place for them. And so we put together a target map based on a model put together by Demos, and then turning around the A5 sheet, people were just asked to say what they thought. What was very interesting then, when we asked people, when people sort of filled in what age group they fell in, was, for example, the fact that socializing, relaxing was more important for the older and younger age groups. It wasn't just a place to swim up and down. You could build the Empire State Building right next to the Lido, but it wouldn't stop you swimming, but it would stop you enjoying it, this experiential landscape as a place to meet new people and make more friends, quote. The pools and the fact that you can just meet your friends up and swim with them and have a good and fun time, said a 10-year-old. Or it's lovely to come to a town-located sports facility and feel in the middle of nowhere. A lot of people recording the site as really important to their lifelong journey. And the planning inspector said on the appeal, because there wasn't even recognition that this Lido existed in the original plans put together for a multi-story car park. It was just called part of the park. And the inspector said, when one considers the Lido in its entirety, is an undoubtedly special place. That the development would have a dramatic and harmful impact on the way that users experience the Lido in its setting. People value the Lido for many reasons beyond its utility as a swimming pool. So we were able to make that connection, if you like, between the Lido as an experiential landscape and really how people value it. Well, Lidos were built, obviously in the interwar period, at a period of huge change. Between the wars, something like, according to the Institute of Building Conservation, Historic Building Conservation, in 2016, we have over 16% of our building stock coming from that period between 1914 and 44, most of it obviously coming after 1919, between 1919 and 1940. Only 2.9% of the building stock, the housing stock, is actually pre-1850, according to these statistics. 16.4% again is 1850 to 1914, and the rest is post-1945. Parts of the country have had differential shares of growth in housing. And this map uses the Natural England's landscape character areas to sort of map the areas that have had differential growth, different sorts of different levels of growth. And this comes from a report commissioned by Peter Bibby before I left Historic England, but it's really looking at how rural settlement has developed in the period from the 1851 census. But it's looking at urban settlement as well. What it's shown is how the pattern of settlement owes so much, in fact, not just to the obvious factors since the 1850s, but also to the pre-existing pattern of settlement in England. This brings one on to the issue of looking at buildings in their broader context. As Henry Glassy, who wrote a wonderful book called Folk Housing Middle Virginia, wrote, "It took me a long time sketching before I could battle past wood and stone to be considering the human beings who left material things as their only legacy." Mike Hodder, in the research framework for the West Midlands, the first one produced 10 years ago, said we need to look at whole landscapes and assess the complete building stock of areas rather than just picking out individual buildings. Touches on, again, looking at this sort of broader context. Matt Johnson, in his book Ideas of Landscape, made the important point that any celebration of particularity is meaningless without an understanding of the general processes against which that particularity is played out. As a reminder of that, just take a look very briefly at this map of the surviving, at least of what is recorded as pre-1550 and what is recorded as pre-1750 in England from the historic buildings lists. All sorts of caveats we can build into this, but nevertheless it shows you a pattern, waves of rebuilding that are evident most strongly in the pre-1550 period in the south of the country and some pockets in northern England, such as around Halifax, the yeoman clothier's houses. And you can see that wave of rebuilding then sort of moving upwards up towards the Solway in the period to 1750. But in fact, such was the extent of rebuilding after the 1750s that so much of the, we might have historic cores of the building stock, but so much of the evident building stock belongs to the period after 1750 in areas where the map is largely green. So we've got these waves of rebuilding, and these waves of rebuilding are fundamentally linked to patterns of change in the landscape. This is an extract from a fantastic map in Worcestershire of the Penryn estate, the Earl of Coventry's estate, and it shows the pattern of scattered settlement, which lies of dispersed settlement, which predominates in England, either side of the central sort of village belt, which was shown on the previous slide. And you can see in red that the areas where the survival of early houses and barns, 1550 to 1650, which largely reflects what survives before 1550, is concentrated. And it bears a very strong relationship to those landscapes of scattered settlement, where the farms and the houses are sitting within fields that have been enclosed, largely enclosed by that period. And then, as Bob Edwards, in our first bit of work looking at farmsteads, produced this map of Hampshire, and this actually just maps the recorded listed buildings on farmsteads, which predate the 1750s. And here you can see the concentration of red dots in the greeny landscapes, again, of these landscapes of dispersed settlement and species-rich hedgerows of fields assarted or cleared from woodland largely by the 14th century. We sort of deepened, well, Bob did this pilot looking at Hampshire more than 10 years ago, and this was really influential in sort of in the way we're able to start looking at the relationship between buildings and spaces, and making this really strong connection between the high density of pre-1550 buildings in the landscape and landscapes largely enclosed by the 14th century. You'll notice at the top left, there's a photograph of a medieval farmstead in a medieval asarted landscape. The more bosky landscapes we found, and again, don't really have time to go into the detail of this, but the landscapes with larger fields are often associated bottom left with and larger fields and mature veteran trees in the hedge boundaries are found often with farmsteads dating from between with buildings dating from between the late 1400s and the early 1700s. But those are buildings of the pre-1750 date are relatively very rare in the blue landscapes, such as in the landscape on the right, where you've got this planned enclosure, this redesign of the landscape, as happened in so much of the northeast of the country in the period after the 1750s, associated with these really large farmsteads such as Hagbourne, which was established in around 1800, which is not listed. And again, you've got huge areas of the country where buildings of real significance that make a really important contribution to landscape and that have a really important story to tell are not only not listed, but often are poorly represented in historic environment records. And this really brings us on to the point that besides, we've got, it's good to start just thinking a bit out of the box about buildings and their spaces. Obvious examples being that besides churches and churchyards, research on the value, we've got research on the value of gardens as habitats, which actually is closely linked to the age of houses. There's even been work done on late 19th, early 20th century arts and craftsy houses and the species diversity associated with gardens there. There's been research by the Sustainable Traditional Buildings Alliance and the benefits of retrofitting older and traditional buildings, and work in Poland and largely actually looking at the links between biodiversity and the age of houses and the age of barns. Well, looking again broadly at this context onto the last few slides, this is on the, you see that there, the map of England, that shows the national character areas put together by Natural England, and these often enable you to put buildings into a broader context of landscapes and places and how they've changed. When I worked with Steve Warnock on the neighbourhood plan for East Hagbourne, which is a village just to the south of Didcot in the upper Thames clay vales, it's really the heartland of village England. There's very little outside of the village of East Hagbourne. The farmsteads here highlighted in green are concentrated in the village. And when we looked at the historic buildings in the village, what really stood out was how many of them were part of working farms in the late 18th century, in the 1780s, which is the date of that map. And we put together a list of key characteristics of East Hagbourne, relating those to the key characteristics of the Upper Thames clay vale that it sits within. And then ask put these of different types, particularly the farmsteads, contribute to the character of East Hagbourne. We asked then in the workshops the residents to sort of score what they particularly valued. Really high up on the list of values is this distinctive character of the traditional farmsteads and farm buildings, the 18th century and earlier vernacular architecture, the 19th century domestic architecture, all within the village, and relating to the pattern of historic routeways, the evidence for the medieval cultivation strips around the village, the fact that this pattern of settlement is so important to the pattern of landscape around the village. But however, it was also apparent that we must not forget about the buildings that are outside of the conservation area. Many buildings in East Hagbourne are listed. Some are at a high grade, a grade 2 star, but none of the buildings on the right-hand side of the slide here were obviously listed. These date from the 1950s. but in fact were designed as part of open spaces, of communal spaces. So integral to these buildings that those are really important for the people that live there as amenity space. Again, think of the buildings as an integral part of the space. So what makes places? Everywhere results from how we've used and made places. Every nook and cranny of our landscapes has been adapted to serve different uses over time. We experience and value places and landscapes in different ways. All places, all landscapes with their, and have character and meaning to different people, and buildings are absolutely critical to sort of contributing to that, a part of this extraordinary pattern of local distinctiveness we have in this country. But they're also, even if they don't make a strong contribution to local distinctiveness, because they're like buildings in other places up and down the country, they are still making a contribution to the story of your place. This might seem a bit facile, but it took a while to think about it, because your place, like you, is a work in process. It will have its own distinctive character, which is developed over time. On the festival website, we've put up this project that I worked on with Willington Primary School near Durham, which Willington is a former coal mining village, as part of the Northern Heartlands project. And we would love it if you wanted to look at the documents and also look at the films that come along with this. A really important part of the project was actually, again, working with the character of the building stock of Willington. This is an extract from the Historic Landscape Characterization Map for Durham, which shows the phases, the developing phases of buildings and development within and around Willington, that enables us then again to see how it relates to the landscape. And there's a Roman road, Deer Street, that passes just to the west of Deer Street, but also that forks off towards Durham at a bridge site just to the west of Willington. But also there's a strong suspicion now that the routeway going through Willington, which is part of the high street, is probably even older than the Roman road, an ancient transhumance route. And there are only 6 buildings listed in Willington. We just really wanted to try and make this point that buildings are an integral part of places, that we might have buildings that have particular meaning and interest to members of the community, such as the Homes for Aged Miners or the Miners Institute in Willington, but that we have buildings that reflect, like the churches, the diversity of communities that came to this place, that suddenly, which saw its population expand from 330 odd in the 1830s to a community of a few thousand by the 1880s. So in summary, this has been a bit of a blast through the fact that buildings are absolutely fundamental to how we can look at places. It's not just the special buildings that matter, but we shouldn't just be focusing on the buildings. We should be looking at how they form part of their places. What sort of places and spaces come with them, from farmyards to gardens to communal space around, let's say, 1950s, 1960s public housing. Looking at perhaps gardens that come with 19th century, came with 19th century hospitals and asylums. The sorts of areas that, brownfield landscapes that come with our industrial heritage, an important part of our so-called edgelands. So I think that it's about asking questions, and the more questions we have, the better. And this is a really rich, our buildings heritage is such a rich resource about which I feel that really we're only scratching the surface of, strangely. We have a great legacy of listed buildings in this country, but I think that there's so much more work to do in looking at whole landscapes, whole places, and how buildings reflect the values of people, what people have aspired to, and how places will change in the future. So thanks. Okay, so I pass on to
You just need to stop sharing your screen, Jeremy, and then Catherine can share hers.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Right. Hi, folks. I'm going to share my screen now, and I'm going to continue talking along the similar sort of theme to what Jeremy was just talking about, which is the way in which places and people relate to each other. I work for the Council for British Archaeology. I'm a listed buildings caseworker. So my day-to-day job involves looking at applications for listed buildings, but also broader aspects of the historic environment and proposed changes that are made to them. So I'm going to talk a bit about how change is managed now. Of course, it's an ongoing and inevitable process. It's happened forever. There are layers of change and renewal and development that go back into the very distant past, and it's inevitable that it continues. We see the phased development of places all around us, from within structures which have different phases of development within themselves, to townscapes which have buildings of different ages. Within landscapes, there's development that stems from different periods. And the built environment, buildings and the built environment, illustrate how people have outwardly expressed what they consider to be important, but they also reveal a lot about how people have lived and used the sites, and how they've evolved through time in reaction to what people have wanted and needed from them. So if I can just move my slide on. The vast majority of our casework focuses on grade 2 buildings, where there is an expectation of adaptive change as being acceptable. And what the CBA particularly focus on is the archaeological interest, or the evidential value that buildings and sites hold, which is around how people have designed and constructed them and used them to meet their needs. Now, the buildings which you can see on your screen here all represent types of buildings that are becoming increasingly redundant in their original form. They were all designed for a specific function, and the form very much relates to the function. They all face a very similar issue now, which is if their function isn't required, then what use does the building have? Who cares for it? And if it doesn't have a use and no one cares for it, how is it maintained? How does it continue into the future? How does it have a future? So in particular areas of the country that industrialized in the 18th and 19th centuries, there's a lot of buildings of a similar scale and proportion to this industrial complex that you can see on the left-hand side of the screen. The form, the linear rows of windows, and the long lengths of building very much relate to the processes of production that happened inside. So that does contribute towards the building's significance. They were huge employers, of course, in the local area, having a massive workforce. They've got very strong links to a social history. Poor working conditions led to instigated social change, labour movements, establishing trade unions. So they hold a lot of communal value for things like that. They're an integral component to the urbanisation of areas in the north, west particularly, I think is where this one came from. But when industry stops, what do you do with the buildings? They basically need to be adapted for a new use. So next across the screen, this is a pretty stereotypical farm complex coming from the 18th or 19th century. You see a lot of reuse around these sort of buildings because they're redundant for contemporary agriculture. The scale just doesn't stack up with modern machinery. But there's a strong group value to these buildings, which were all designed to form very specific functions within a group relating to a complete farming system. So the fact if there's a hayloft, that's really contributes to our understanding of its role. Threshing floors with big open opposing doors, or the fact that there's ventilation slits in cow sheds rather than big windows is very much related to the fact that cows need airflow rather than a view. So it requires a degree of sensitivity and understanding what it is that it's important about a place to inform how it gets changed. Moving that screen, sorry. So then there's a nonconformist chapel. In the 18th and 19th centuries, again, they sprung up all over the place. They were really important buildings to the community. As people are less God-fearing than they used to be and congregations dwindle, they become really hard to maintain for communities, even though they have quite a central place at the heart of a community. So again, they need a new use. And then the picture on the far right of the screen is York Central Post Office. And the post office are selling off their built assets across the country. And so they need new use. And this building type marks a massive breakthrough in communication logistics. All of these buildings represent key developments of their time. And they contribute to a sense of place. They contribute to the identity of where they are. So it's clearly preferable to keep these buildings rather than lose them, but they need it to be adapted in a way that's sensitive to their historical significance. So, to successfully adapt a place to a new use or to meet new requirements, you first need to understand its significance. Not every aspect of a building is equally important. And we talk about significance or special interests of a building, where the basic idea is that you assess what is significant about a place, which aspects of its built form and its setting express this significance. And in doing so, you also identify which aspects of a site hold less significance. And as such, they're the areas which are most open to change and the most easily adaptable to contemporary and future needs, whilst minimising harm to what is interesting or important about a place. So significance is a term that is written into UK planning policy, and it's best explained in a guidance document produced by Historic England in 2008 called Conservation Principles. So conservation principles breaks significance down into 4 constituent values, and that's what I've put on this slide. I recognise some of the names from the chat, so I know I'm preaching to the choir in this, but just in case some of you aren't so familiar with this, the 4 constituent values of significance that's broken down into evidential value, which basically equates to the archaeological interest of a place. So that's what a place can tell you about the past human activity that happened somewhere. The historical value of a place might be the way in which people connected to it in the past and how that now comes out into the present. It might be illustrative in terms of the design. It might be associative in terms of people who were there historically. The aesthetic value is how people draw sensory stimulation from a place. It's heavily associated with what somewhere looks like. And the communal value of the place is what it means for people who relate to it. It would be unusual when you're assessing the significance of a place for all the values to be equal. It's normal that somewhere might have high communal value. For example, the chapel we saw in the previous slide. Factories might also have strong communal value. They'll also have evidential value in terms of the processes which are expressed through the layout. Farm complexes have high evidential value in understanding the way in which the form expresses the function and how they relate as a group. So the basic idea is that in order to manage change successfully and to understand a place's significance, you identify the building components, and it might be a plan form, it might be the built fabric, it might be fixtures and fittings that communicate how past people have designed and used these spaces and places to perform specific functions and to meet historical needs. So when the Council for British Archaeology are assessing applications, we're looking to see that any harm to the significance is minimised, and where there is harm, and inevitably there is a degree of harm because you're adapting it to meet a new use, that harm needs to be justified in order to achieve the site's sustainable future. And buildings can tell us quite a lot about how people have lived there. So in terms of plan form, how spaces are divided up, did people do everything in one space? In the 19th century, with the advent of sculleries and back kitchens and rear offshots, it would have made a massive impact on day-to-day life, being able to separate the dirty day-to-dayness from the politer, smarter areas of a house. And that sort of rolled out across the board in a way that had only existed in sort of like more well-to-do houses up until then. Within commercial premises, the different areas make different statements about relative importance. So you come across quite detailed and ornate finishes in a shop front, whereas the back of house rooms are really quite plain. If you're in civic buildings, you might find that a supervisor's room has distinctly improved status, and that might be from being a sort of like a separate individual room for one person. It might have its own fireplace, or often there's an internal observation window, and these sort of things say quite a lot about the hierarchy of different areas and different roles within an organisation. You also get quite a lot of practical measures incorporated into buildings. So, for example, wooden window shutters are not just characterful, they're also practical. If you have a staircase which is in a room rather than coming out of a hallway, you'll find there's a door at the bottom of the staircase. Because if there wasn't a door, then the staircase would act like a chimney and suck all of the warm air out of the room. So there are reasons why it's there, and understanding the reasons why these fixtures and fittings are there helps you understand how people have lived there and actually adapted to a similar sort of situation, like wanting to stay warm, as we do today. Lots of the planning applications that the Council for British Archaeology are consulted on at the moment all seek to achieve the 21st century ideal of open plan living. And I think that when people look back at our phase of development on buildings, they're going to see that we all like to live in our kitchens together. So anyway, I'm going to talk you through an application that we've had that I really like. So civic buildings and polite architecture can look very impressive, and they tell us about the outward messages that people sought to communicate. But sometimes the more easily missed and ignored places tell us quite a lot about the everyday lives of people. And so this is an application in New Street in Cornwall. Welcome to New Street. I'm hoping that you can see my cursor. New Street was new in the late 18th century. This is the front of the building we're talking about. So it's double fronted, central entrance passageway. Here you can see Penryn, where it is. This is New Street. Most of these buildings are listed at grade 2. This one is also listed at grade 2. It's running down towards the harbour. This is the main Market Street up at the top. This is the harbour. It's just around the corner from Falmouth Bay. This application concerns a string of outbuildings to the rear of the house. So this is the rear of the house. This is the back of the main body of the house. You can see a link structure here that connects to an outhouse. In this picture, you can see the outhouse, that's the link structure, and beyond the outhouse is this shed. So what I would like you to take from these pictures and just lock in your memories is this link structure. This is a brick construction. It's later than this outhouse that it's joining onto the back of the building. It's got a bit of a crummy, leaky roof light here, and the pitch of the roof is cutting across the first floor window. You can see the wave machine that seems to be working on the roof here. So they're old slates, but the roof is sagging and giving way. This is quite an old structure, probably contemporary with the main house. You can see these granite blocks at the bottom here is a plinth which stop here underneath the window. So that's a bit of historic infill. This shed has a tin roof and a tin front. These are later, late 19th, early 20th century roof and front to this shed. Also have a note here, there's a window. This is the kitchen of the house. So This outbuilding exemplifies Cornish vernacular architecture at the end of the 18th century. And when we look inside, there's legible shifts in the domestic requirements that changed into the 19th century and then again into the 20th century. The principal outbuilding is a washhouse or scullery, and it's a workshop beyond. Now, often these sort of auxiliary structures are viewed as low-grade construction that lack historical significance, so they're very easily swept away and lost. But their existence kept the dirty work out of the politer main body of the house. They were crucial to day-to-day life. And they often hold a lot of evidential value or archaeological interest relating to the everyday lives of past residents who lived there. And their low-grade construction, or the reused building fabric which they're constructed with, evidences the historical attitudes towards these spaces too, which in fact creates a fuller picture of the people. Now, it's no surprise that with a reduction in cottage industries and domestic tasks not relying on cheap labour anymore, but white goods, washing machines and the like, these structures become redundant. Their maintenance is reduced and they start to be used for storage, at which point they fall into a state of disrepair. So I'll just tell you what we're looking at in these pictures. This central chimney and fireplace is in the principal outhouse. Here in this picture, you can see the door looking out towards the back of the house. This is the same doorway looking out towards that kitchen window. You can see the underside of the slates here. This is the window into the garden with the infill underneath. This back wall of the house is constructed in cob, which is quite a rare building material, which we do look to preserve really. This is the side wall of the link structure, and this is the crummy conservation. This is the crummy roof light that you could see. This building here is the shed beyond. Okay, it's got some wood underboarding the tin roof, which is also coming down. You've got an old workbench here. It's storage. This is the same building from a different angle. You can see the amount of moss and slime and green that's growing on the wall here. Basically, both are unmaintained buildings. Now, you can see here, this has had a copper. There was a copper here for washhouse purposes. There was probably a range in here. There's a massive crack on this granite lintel. It's not structurally sound. In the 19th century, the fireplace was altered and this surrounding grate will have been put in. In the 20th century, the attitude towards these spaces is shown through the bodging up with brick. Basically, it's been shored up for structural purposes, but rendered absolutely useless. So other things to note here, we've got a granite flags floor, the roof being held up by an acro prop. The windows rotten beyond repair, the roof sagging, and basically the dilapidated condition of these buildings is a real threat to their long-term survival. So achieving a well-constructed and functional use for these buildings would ensure their sustainable future, as well as a degree of legibility about their past use. And for a building to have a future, it has got to have a use, because no one would take on a project like this unless it had a purpose. So let's have a look what was proposed. So just to give you an idea of what we're looking at here, this is the main building. This is the front door that we saw from the street. Central passageway going straight through. This probably is the original 18th century plan form of the house. And here you see the outbuildings. This is the little link building, wash house, shed. Now, what the applicants wanted to do here was achieve a bigger kitchen. This is the kitchen, it's quite small. They wanted a downstairs toilet and shower room, doesn't sound unreasonable, a dark room and a photographic studio. Now, in order to achieve a bigger kitchen, if you have a look at this plan form, what are their options? They could go through this wall and take out the staircase. That's not desirable. Staircase is primary historic fabric. They could knock through the room into the front wall into the front room. That's damaging the original plan form. They could annex this little link building, which doesn't seem like a bad idea. This is so, despite the fact that they're proposing to take out a section of the rear wall of the house, and in fact, so this proposed plan is just looking at the outsheds. What they're proposing to do is take out a piece of this cob wall, take out the window at the back of the building, and knock through to create an extended kitchen into this link building. If you remember, this wall here was a later red brick building. The roof, the pitch cuts across the first floor window. It's not significant to the building, so we didn't have any issue really with taking that out, moving that wall further back here. And in fact, this window that they're taking out here, they're proposing to reuse here. So while we might have thought that was a bit controversial, it's totally justified in this instance. Now, another rather more controversial aspect of this proposal is the proposed removal of this chimney breast and fireplace, or at least it would be controversial if it wasn't in such a horrendous condition. But as it stands, the copper's lost, the granite fire lintel is cracked, it's structurally unsound. In order to do anything in this building, they would have to take down this structure and rebuild it. It would be wildly expensive and all the evidential value would be lost. So on balance, it's justified if it's in order to achieve a reuse for these outbuildings. So they proposed also to take the roof off. The wooden structure is shot, that's fine, take it down, and they're putting the slates, reusing the same slates and putting it back up. Something else that we really liked about this application is that in order to achieve this wall at the side of the kitchen, they're looking to reincorporate the fabric which came from the removed chimney, as well as reusing the window that came out of the kitchen wall. And the reuse of built fabric is the continuation of an age-old practice of adaptation and change, which buildings like this will have seen forever, or for as long as the building's been in existence. It's a continuation of an attitude which is very much in keeping with buildings, adapting to contemporary needs in a way that doesn't actually harm their significance. The proposed methodology for this site was really sympathetic to the significance of the historic fabric. So the existing granite slabbed floor in the outhouse is to be retained, cleaned, undisturbed, and the new services for the proposed toilet and bathroom are going to be routed above the floor, including all the drainage pipework. In the shed here, so they're knocking through here in order to go from, I think that this is a dark room and this is a photographic studio. The corrugated metal roof and the front wall have both failed, and they're going to be replaced in zinc sheet. Now, the way that the CBA viewed this application was that we liked it. The interventions have been kept to a minimum. They're justified in order to achieve a sustainable new use for these outbuildings in a way that doesn't actually harm their character. In some regards, the new darkroom use is a 21st century continuation of a small cottage industry. And in fact, the cooking and washing facilities kind of ring true to the historical uses too. We were sympathetic to the argument that repurposing these outbuildings into a more usable domestic space does relieve pressure on the main building to adapt. And we were really pleased to see that quality 21st century design was used to achieve these ends. So rather than, so the use of zinc sheeting for the roof is, will achieve quite quietly, it'll achieve a contemporary piece along the building's narrative. So the space will continue to meet the needs of residents in fulfilling their everyday lives. The significance of the site is maintained and the buildings are conserved and their future secured. So yeah, that's what I was going to tell you about. Now I'll stop sharing my screen and I will hand over to Bev, who's going to do the next presentation. I should just say, if anyone has any questions as we're going along, feel free to stick them in the chat and we'll go through them at the end. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Catherine. I really enjoyed your run through the outbuilding casework. That was excellent. Very interesting. Thank you for that. Okay, I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Let's hope I can. There we go. Now, just let me know if I haven't managed to. Let me start the slide show now. Okay. Right. Okay, yes. So thanks, Catherine, for that. I would add that I've also worked for the CBA, so I've also seen similar sort of casework. And so I worked for the CBA for a number of years, quite some time ago now, actually, in Wales and in the York office. So thanks for that. I'm now a heritage consultant with Purcell, and we're a practice of conservation architects and master planners and heritage consultants. And I'm also a committee member of the CIFA's Buildings Archaeology Group. So, excuse me. So thanks for allowing me to talk today, Jeremy, and for organising this. My short talk that I'm going to give, I hope you find enjoyable. I'm hoping I'm touching on the sort of similar themes that both Jeremy and Catherine have started with. And what I'm looking at in my talk is I'm looking at some specific buildings that are part of an industrial landscape, but they have the potential to be so much more. Over time, these buildings and their landscape have evolved, they've changed, they've grown, and they've declined. And these buildings were constructed to meet specific needs, but they've been adapted and changed as new needs have arisen, a little bit like Catherine's example that is continuing to be changed and adapted. Indeed, some of these buildings were actually abandoned as the needs that they were no longer fulfilled. These changes are evident within their built fabric and can be read and interpreted with the right approach, i.e. a combination of historical research and archaeological analysis. So I've chosen for my talk a set of railway buildings located in what is now a suburb of Darlington. Now, I apologise for any of you who are attending this talk right now if you're already familiar with this particular landscape of buildings and my light touch in this particular talk. I won't go into any major detail, but I will talk about one building in particular. Now, the area is part of Stockton and Darlington's Railway Heritage Action Zone, which was launched in 2018. Now, these heritage action zones, if you're not already familiar with them, are where Historic England works with local partners to rejuvenate and restore historic places. In this case, the historic line of the historic Stockton and Darlington Railway in the build-up to its bicentenary in 2025. The plan is to realise its potential to become a major heritage attraction, international visitor destination, and a driver for long-term economic growth and the regeneration of the local area, all in Darlington. No laughing. For those of you who are railway enthusiasts, you may be familiar with Stockton and Darlington's involvement in the birth of the railway. And on the 27th of September, 1825, a steam locomotive suitably called Locomotion Number 1 hauled its first consignment of coal wagons along with various dignitaries, guests, and the S&DR committee who were installed in their own railway coach, also suitably called Experiment. The length of the line was just 26 miles, but it grew rapidly in the following years, operating a freight service by steam locomotive from the outset, and later carrying fare-paying passengers. The significance of the S&DR is not in its use of new technology or its mode of traction. It was not the first steam railway. It wasn't the first to use iron rails, and it wasn't the first sustainable commercial railway. Its significance lies in the fact that it brought all of these developments together, offering the world's first steam locomotive public railway service. And when it opened in 1825, Stockton and Darlington Railway included a short branch to a coal depot on High Northgate. The triangular area formed by the angle between the main line, which runs along here, and the branch line along here, became the focus of the Stockton and Darlington subsequent development in Darlington. It was called North Road after the continuation of the thoroughfare that formed the triangle's eastern side. So this is the area that I'm talking about today. We've got the, it's known as the North Road Triangle, not surprisingly. Here's Hopetown Lane, which runs down here. We've got North Road up to about this point here, and High Northgate continues down here. This along here is McNay Street, which I'll mention later. But the oldest structure that I've labelled here is in fact the Skerne Bridge, which is a scheduled monument, and it's shown here to the east. It was also in the painting that I showed you just earlier, and it features on the opening day of the S&DR in 1825, and there it is just there to the right. Now, the oldest structure in the site is the goods depot located just here. Then the line depot, which is from round about 1840, which is located round about here. It actually replaced an earlier one from round about 1825, located around about here. North Road Station was built round about the same time, about 1840s. And the goods agent's office, which is associated with the goods depot here, is located just here, and was also built round about the mid 19th century. And the final building that was built on the site is the Carriage Works building just here, and that dates to about 1853. I also should mention the fact that located here of archaeological significance is the site of Kitchen's Iron Foundry, which just sat in the little corner of the triangle. Also located off the map, but not shown here, is another building, which is the S&DR's engine shed from about 1861, which is also being considered as part of the wider master plan for the area. So the North Road site expanded and developed through the 19th century, along with large areas of associated housing, especially when the North Road locomotive works were established north of the area. Now, you'll see here in the mid 19th century that the area is in fact located in what is almost a rural setting, with allotment gardens and fields and tree boundaries, etc. There's the goods station just there, just locate there's the carriage works, and there's the railway foundry, just the iron foundry just there, for example. And also up here, located up the top here, you'll see is the locomotive works, which is slightly later. Okay. So it became a busy railway hub, as I say, including the iron foundry, which supplied parts for the locomotive works and the carriage works. But when the S&DR merged with the North Eastern Railway in 1863, the North Road area became a minor satellite rather than a major railway hub. Facilities and services were transferred to places like York, for example. Development of the site actually ceased, and no new buildings of any significance were erected, though it continued in use. And as industry and the railway entered a crisis, so the area declined. And by the 20th century, a number of the buildings at North Road had been demolished, and others became derelict or run down. The railway tracks that had led into the triangle were removed, and the iron foundry was demolished in the 1970s, as no new use could be found for it. The locomotive works also suffered the same fate, and it's now the site of the Morrison's supermarket. But with some foresight, in around about 1975, some of the surviving buildings were actually purchased by Darlington Council. Parts of the station were in fact converted to a museum, which is now called the Head of Steam. The carriage works, which you can see here in a rather derelict condition, were let out to 2 locomotive trusts, and they're now used as workshops. The goods agent's office was a nursery and is now offices, and the lime sheds, unfortunately, are still derelict, and they're still up for sale, as no new use has yet been found for them. One of the most significant buildings on the site is the goods depot. It's listed at grade 2 star. It probably doesn't look like anything very special to most people who live there, or indeed who are looking at this particular talk. It was added to Historic England's building at risk register quite recently. The clock tower is in a precarious position and condition and it's currently propped from the inside by the cab of the locomotive. The building is in use by a group of railway enthusiasts as their workshop, but it still remains in very poor condition. I was recently involved with Historic England in investigating this particular building as part of the HAS project, which is feeding into the master plan for the area. And by applying both research methodologies and a detailed analysis of the built fabric, it was possible to start to unravel the building's development. And here I would qualify that we have just started to unravel it, and the work we've done has been based upon work by many other teams of people who've also looked at the building. But I still feel we've scratched the surface and there's still quite a lot more to discover about this particular building. So the goods depot was originally known as the merchandise station, and as the oldest surviving formal building to be erected by the Stockton and Darlington Railway. It's also the earliest surviving single-storey goods shed in the world. It was built to a design by Thomas Story, who was then engineer to the S&DR, and he chose to adopt a classical Italianate form. Construction was completed in June of 1833. Unlike later goods sheds, wagons entered through a series of archways into the long facade rather than via the gable ends. And the wagon entry is distinguished by the high arches and the loading bays by the low arches, which were probably fitted with windows, as in this drawing, though we don't know for absolute certainty. So those are the high arches. This in fact is representing this particular bay here. And this is the low arch, which would have been a loading bay. It was situated here. The recent archaeological analysis of the fabric has suggested that the early building developed in 3 primary phases and not 2 as has been purported. The first 4 bays, that's these ones here, in the south elevation were built in 1833. Then between 1833 and 1839, the building was rapidly expanded westwards. They clearly realised that the building wasn't big enough when they first constructed it, and it rapidly expanded this way, with the addition of a further 4 bays. And it, although it's not immediately obvious to most people, the differences between the design of the 2 halves, there's a lack of symmetry, there's a change in the widths of the bays, and a difference in the stone tooling that are the clues to the slightly different dates. And internally, there is an archway and a length of wall that have been identified as once being the building's external north wall and part of the primary phase of construction. And that's this image just here. We're actually looking at the inner face of that wall. So it's these kind of clues which also evidence the expansion of the building northwards between 1839 and 40. This time to designs by the engineer John Harris. This northward expansion saw the construction of this prominent clock tower, and the archways on the north elevation are slightly different again, in that they've got these shouldered arches, excuse me, as you can see here. And they are also of different widths to the opposite bays on the south side. They perhaps reflect the rapidly increasing size of wagons at that particular time. And so at some point after 1854, the goods depot was repurposed, and it's thought that the goods depot was probably too small and its design was too inefficient to cope with the S&DR's expanding goods business. They had purchased a building opposite the North Road station, which became their new goods depot. And we can see that reuse of the building again in the fabric. It was when these open archways used for wagon entry were enclosed with secondary arches and keystones, and the windows were inserted. It's clear, excuse me, it's clear from the way this was done, i.e. that it was done with some skill and some care, that the building was still held in some sort of esteem, although we don't really know what sort of use it was put to at this particular moment in time. What we do know, though, is that by the later 19th century, it was adapted as a fire station by the NER. And you'll see here the firemen with their fire tender mounted on a truck, sitting on a turntable, which is actually facing the goods depot building, and North Road Station is situated in the background. The large doors that we see here were possibly inserted at that particular time to allow a fire tender to enter, but it's not, again, altogether clear. They also fitted a stove and a chimney for the comfort, presumably, of the firemen, and the roof was lined out with sarking boards. Again, these are indicators of changes to the building and its new use. It was later also used as a lumberyard and a motor vehicle garage, also shown here. And so we were able to eventually build up a picture of the building's development through a variety of sources and observations. And we produced this phased plan. Again, this is based, I would add, on not just our work, but on the work of other people who've also looked at the building. So we've got the primary phase is shown here, secondary phase when it was rapidly expanded this way, and then a northern extension here. We've also been able to indicate the infilling, and that this particular facade here, these 4 bays here were probably completely rebuilt at that particular time to insert the larger doors. And the clock tower is shown there. So an important observation from research has been that the east elevation, which is now overgrown and inaccessible, was once the principal elevation. It was here that clients would deliver or collect their goods, and it was where the goods agent's office was built in later years. And as part of the master plan that's being developed, re-establishing this relationship with North Road and McNay Street will be important. Also of importance will be the reconnection of this building with the other historic buildings within the North Road Triangle. What is proposed is that the goods depot becomes the entry point into the site for signposting, information displays, and with a cafe area. And from here, visitors can then move on to the Railway Museum, make other connections within the site, for example, to the Carriage Works, which is being considered as an education centre. Potentially, visitors may also be able to move on to see live engineering works in the restored S&DR engine shed that I mentioned earlier. I would also add that there's various organisations have been involved in this design work, and these latest designs are by Space and are available on their website. So in conclusion, and to wrap up my talk, I've touched on a set of railway buildings which have formed part of an industrial landscape and are now the focus of an ongoing project of regeneration. Projects like these, which enhance local heritage, have the potential to re-energise neglected areas. And a key element is for local communities to re-engage with their heritage. It's hoped that a better understanding of these buildings, some of which might be considered to be ugly or eyesores, can help generate a greater sense of appreciation, pride, and belonging in the local area. Crucially, maintaining and enhancing our heritage provides a basis for local economic development and innovations and tourism. Innovations in tourism, entertainment, education, and business generally. Soon it is hoped that the largely forgotten part of Darlington will be recognised and appreciated for its part in the birth of the railways. Sorry, I moved on a bit too quickly, but thank you there. And this is one of the latest research reports which are on Historic England's website. There's also one by Archaeo-Environmental on the lime depot if you have any interest at all. And there's another one coming as well on the carriage works, which will hopefully soon be published. Thanks very much. I'll stop sharing now.
That was really interesting, Bev. It sounds like Darlington are doing some great things at the moment.
Yes, indeed, yeah. And with the anniversary coming up in 2025, let's hope that we can, you know, they can get things into gear for the bicentenary. So yeah, there's lots to be done, I think, and lots of decisions that still need making, I think. So yeah, plenty to do.
You had a question from David Stocker on the chat while you were speaking. Let me just see if I can find it.
I've got it, Catherine. He says, very interesting to see the thought going into the S&D heritage focus in Darlington, Bev. Thank you. Are NRM involved in the project?
They, I believe, are partners as part of the overall master. There's a lot of partners involved, and I do believe that they are probably involved. Almost certainly they are. I'd have to check the list though, David. But thanks for your question.
Do you want me to, because you're all talking and busy, I took the questions out. Do you want me to just feed them to you? Would that be helpful, or are you?
Oh, thank Debbie, please. That sounds great.
Okay. During your talk, Jeremy, Richard Hughes says, surely the rebuilding also reflects on things like fires and floods, etc., in the population growth and the progressive development of building codes and construction standards, with the ability at the time to retrofit for modernisation.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I did a quick response in the chat, but essentially the destruction by fire, yes, of course, it doesn't tend to sort of disrupt the pattern, if you like, the landscape scale pattern of phases of rebuilding or waves of rebuilding that we see in those maps. In the case of fires, yeah, it is interesting to look at it. I did a study of my own hometown, actually, at Nantwich in Cheshire, which was burned down by fire in 1583, and actually it was the subject of the very first sort of national appeal. The Great and the Good of Nantwich went down to London to twist the arm of Walsingham and others. What was interesting there actually is that it's very much a case of sort of new wine in old bottles. A lot of the buildings were simply rebuilt in timber frame, came from Delamere Forest, reusing a lot of timber. You'll see a lot of reused timber in attics and other components of the buildings. The buildings were built in exactly the same plots. It just had to be done in a hurry. There are some examples like Blandford Forum, where the rebuilding in the early 18th century, I've forgotten when exactly, 1720s, I think, that was rebuilding in brick. So that's a sort of short as I can answer to that.
Kat, there was, somebody did ask, Richard Hughes asked if you could say something about carbon economics, but lots of people gave him signpostings in the chat, so I think that was covered. And then the final one was Martin Lowcock. Not all buildings can be protected as listed buildings, but how many are included on the historic environment records so that they are taken into account when development proposals are being prepared?
So I've got some answer. Oh, sorry, Kath, do you want to answer first and I'll answer after you? Yeah, sorry.
Well, I was just going to quickly say that being on the historic environment record gives them no protection at all, unless I don't know if anyone would disagree. If the locally listed buildings are a material consideration within the planning system to a degree, but they're quite easily balanced against in reality. If there's a grand scheme that requires the demolition of a locally listed building, it's in the planning balance. It's not necessarily protected, although its reuse would definitely be preferable. I don't know what anyone else thinks.
Yeah. I mean, the local lists have become quite prominent lately, haven't they? There's a lot of money now going into either the update and creation or the involvement of local communities in creating local lists. So I'm guessing that they're becoming more prominent, and potentially communities could have a greater say, I suppose. Well, unless new planning laws say something different about that. But I guess, yeah, there's not a great deal of protection. Part of the conservation area, maybe. That's about it, really, isn't it?
I think the other point to sort of build on what you're both saying is that, well, for a start, listing as it started in the late 1940s was not great at identifying buildings in areas of scattered settlement unless they were already marked and known about, and people were directed to them. The situation was a lot better in the resurvey of the 1980s. That was subject to different phases of resurvey by different people. And there was a bit of local variation, but the inevitable thing that happened in the 1980s was that because it was a rolling parish by parish survey, of course, it's only when you finished it, you can look back and think, have we got this right? And when we did analyses of the effectiveness of how the list reflected current knowledge in some areas, we found gaps, that there are buildings which should be listed that weren't, but also it's the extent of later rebuilding, which you can walk into I recently walked into a pub in Suffolk, just looked completely 19th century on the outside, and wham bam, you got a 15th century interior. It was astonishing. And now this sort of thing happens quite a lot. So you can go to counters that have a lot of time depth, like sort of the claylands of Suffolk or Devon, and you've got a lot of buildings which it's only really the position of the stack or the entrance in relationship to the stack, that chimney stack, that can give you that sort of hint. Local listings are really difficult because if you look at local lists, they tend to be in built up areas. So we've got a local list here in Cheltenham. I worked in West Kent recently. They have a local list there in that local authority, but all the locally listed buildings are actually in the built up areas. There are none outside where you might have, for example, a farm with a medieval house, 19th century working buildings, which now with curtilage law are increasingly hard to attach to the principal curtilage item.
I wonder if that's more associated with the lack of, of the population who would recommend certain buildings for listing.
Yeah.
There's more people to, make those recommendations in urban areas. I guess that's an issue, isn't it, that needs addressing within this new push for local lists and building them up and getting them out there. So yeah.
I'm just sorry, a lot of cost goes into it. But, yeah, neighbourhood plans. If neighbourhood plans are done, I've just seen a note by David Stocker. Yeah, an adopted neighbourhood plan. Yeah, can be really effective. It's about local communities being able to identify, and I suppose, I don't know whether the role for us lot should be trying to provide, or at least provide people with the links to where they can get further information and understand, more about their area in a context. Yeah.
There's expectations out there that it's going to feed into planning reforms, which are due to come out in the autumn. We're expecting to hear more about quite a big shake-up of the planning system. And the government, I think, are quite sympathetic to heritage and listed buildings. I'm not sure that they totally understand that they don't happen in zones. But there's definitely an emphasis growing on locally listing, well, for communities to identify what matters to them, and the way in which that'll shake out is yet to be seen. But yes, do watch this space and speak up, because I expect it will be necessary.
Yeah, and a good point by Mary Twomey about having recently worked in local authorities. It's not uncommon to find locally listed buildings being spot listed due to development threats.
Yes.
You can do rapid mapping. I suppose one thing I was involved with Bob Edwards doing the pilot work was the rapid mapping of farmsteads. So you can go to some HERs and like Kent, which are publicly available, and you've got all the farmsteads there with a brief note. But that's just from rapid mapping, from literally 5 minutes or less, just looking at each site. But it gives you a heads up on the heritage potential. And Worcestershire's done some good work on looking at tithe maps, and but it's all very labour intensive. As soon as you move out of, unless you do things like mapping, rapid mapping, or looking at broader character areas, perhaps, where you say, in this area, you are perhaps more or less likely to find 17th century timber frame behind brick rebuilding, for example, which can give you a good sort of heads up, sort of using characterization in that way. I don't really know how that is with regard to resources. I just worry a little bit about the resources for local listing, that's all.
Yeah, I think so. The local authorities.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, massive issue. Definitely.
There's no other questions in the chat. If anybody wants to ask a question, I suppose if you do the reactions and put your hand up, but if I doubt everybody's going to go at once, if you can just speak and ask a question, I think. If nobody, I can't see anyone. There's no hands up. Okay, well, I'm going to launch the poll if you wouldn't mind answering the 3 questions. It'll come up on your screen.
Oh, it's looking lovely. Thanks, chaps. People, sorry.
That was really...
It's hard to pitch something like this. And I was also conscious of the fact my introduction was very kind of scooting over stuff, and then with Bev and Catherine's much more detailed analysis of things. But I think it's setting out the stall and relating that particularity, a bit like Matt Johnson said, to the generality. I think that's what, if we can start to unlock that and looking at buildings, that would be my own personal holy grail, frankly.
Yes.
Just to ask questions. Don't worry about not having all the answers. Just I think it's a great subject.
Hello, I'm Jeff. Can I ask a question?
Please do.
Of course.
Yeah. Okay. I'm a local architect in Stroud, and I'm working on an old factory building which needs replacement windows and repairs. And I wondered if there's any organisation that I can go to get advice, local advice on the history of the building, on methods of construction, all of that stuff before I go to the conservation officer at the council. So I want to do my own research beforehand. But
The places that I would look
yeah,
would be Victoria County Histories.
right.
I would check out SPAB's advice, and Historic England have a lot of practical advice on their website. I would Historic England on their website.
England, yeah.
A lot of conservation advice. They would be the first sort of places that I would look.
Right.
I'd also say the Stroud Valley Mills. There's been quite a lot of study of the Stroud Valley Mills and the mills going down into Wiltshire and Somerset from Gloucestershire. You've got some really significant ones there.
Yeah, Stanley Mill and
study of those.
yeah.
And really, probably there's no substitute for, I don't know, if you've got a local consultant, someone who works on historic buildings, being able to give you some advice, or even getting in touch with your local history group in terms of, there would be, I think they're positive there's an active one in Stroud, who probably would be able to tell you a lot about the building. And as regards to the issues with fabric, as Catherine said, look at SPAD, see what they advise about windows and window replacement.
Yeah.
And Historic England guidance is really good and practical about things like windows as well.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Roger has a hand up.
Yes, thank you. I'm not quite sure how to ask this question really, but a lot of the work which has been going on that you've been talking about this afternoon relates to research and finding out about what has happened to buildings in the past in order to make them relevant to the present. I wonder if it's possible to think about how it might be to protect modern buildings so that in 100 years' time, people don't have to do the same kind of thing with today's buildings.
Yeah.
Well, so certainly picking up on what Marie Twomey put in the chat about spot listing, the 20th Century Society, who haven't actually drawn a line underneath their period of interest at the end of the 20th century, they're ongoing. They keep a keen eye on development proposals and are quite hot on spot listing interesting 20th century buildings which aren't protected but through any kind of designation. I don't know if that's what you mean. But otherwise, there's probably, to ensure that buildings that we construct now stand the test of time into the future, I think that a focus on construction techniques being to be long lasting rather than cheap and quick to throw up is probably quite helpful.
And Jeff, I just sent you a link to stuff on which, well, I hate to say I worked on it with Worcestershire County.
Right, thanks.
About 20th century buildings and looking at setting what there is in Worcestershire but into a broader national context of understanding. And I think understanding is key. A lot of the focus in 20th century is obviously on post-war has been on sort of extending one's perception of what is significant. And there's been wonderful work done on sort of looking at what is the most significant. But I think there are examples of 20th century heritage, like our unlisted Lido that I mentioned, that are at risk of being underappreciated. It's a matter of sort of relating people's perceptions and values to what there is. Also, there's this issue of adaptation, which is a big issue, let's say, with wartime structures, intended to only last for a period of time, which was an issue at Bletchley. But they have particular problems. I was involved with Saltdean Lido, where we had a real issue with the rebar of the concrete, and there's the big issue of how much should you rebuild in facsimile, which I don't think has got fully sorted out yet. So they bring their own problems.
Thank you very much for the comments.
There's no more questions, and it's 3:30, so well done, sticking to time. Thank you very much. I'll end the session, and thank you for doing the poll. And if you can do the survey that gets emailed to you, we'd really appreciate it, because it helps us get further funding. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.